Namas Sarvebhyah. In this video, we will learn about the Shatru Pratyaya in Sanskrit grammar. The Shatru Pratyaya is one of the 140 Krut Pratyayas, which means that it gets attached to a dhatu and the result is always a Pratipadikam. For example, when the Shatru Pratyaya is attached to the verb patha, we get the Pratipadikam pathat, and similarly, when the Shatru Pratyaya is attached to the verb kru, we get the Pratipadikam kurvat. Let's learn more about this Pratyay. First, the Shatru Pratyay is typically used to indicate an action that happens in the Vartamana Kala, the present tense. For example, the statement Devadattaha Pathati can be rewritten using the Shatru Pratyayanta form by saying Devadattaha Pathan Asti. Both these examples mean one and the same thing. Devadatta reads or Devadatta is reading. In this context, it must be noted that it is a common and a highly believed misconception that the Shatru Pratyaya is used to indicate only the present continuous tense. That's not correct. Technically speaking, Sanskrit language does not distinguish between the simple present and the present continuous tense. There is only one present tense in Sanskrit, which can either be represented using the lat lakara or by using the Shatru Pratyaya. So which dhatus get the Shatru Pratyaya? The Shatru Pratyaya can only be used with the verbs which can get the Parasmai Pada Pratyayas for the Lat Lakara. Please note, this is not the same as simply checking the Pada of the Dhatu in the Dhatu Patha. To understand why, here are a few examples. Let's start with a simple case. The Patha Dhatu is Parasmai Padi in the Dhatu Patha, so it indeed gets the Shatru Pratyaya. The Kru Dhatu, on the other hand, is technically Ubhayapadi, which means it definitely gets the Pratyayas of the Parasmai Pada, and so it can also get the Shatru Pratyaya. The third example is interesting. The Rama Dhatu is actually Atmanepadi, but when the V Upasarga is attached to it, it can only get the Pratyayas of Parasmai Pada, giving forms like Viramati, and therefore, in presence of the V Upasarga, the Rama Dhatu can indeed get the Shatru Pratyaya. Similarly, the Vrudha Dhatu is technically Atmanepadi, but when the Nich Pratyaya is attached to it, it can get the Pratyayas of Parasmai Pada and thus also the Shatru Pratyaya. As another example, Pana Dhatu is Atmanepadi, but for the Lat Lakara, it always accepts the Aya Pratyaya and can only exhibit the Parasmai Pada forms, thus also making it possible to get the Shatru Pratyaya. Finally, the last example shows that an Atideshika Dhatu called Putriya, which is obtained by adding the Kyacha Pratyaya to the word Putra, also gets the Pratyayas of Parasmai Pada and thus the Shatru Pratyaya. In this way, any dhatu that can get the pratyaya of the Parasmai Pada is eligible to get the Shatru Pratyaya. Once we confirm that a dhatu gets the Shatru Pratyaya, the next step is to actually attach the Shatru Pratyaya and create a Pratipadika. The technique to do that is fortunately very simple. We simply take the Parasmai Pada Prathama Purusha Bahuvachana form of the Lat Lakara, which usually ends in either nti or ti, and we replace this terminal letter by the letter ta to get the Shatru Pratyayanta Pratipadika. For instance, Patha plus Shatru becomes Pathat. The terminal nti has been replaced by the letter ta. Similarly, ghra plus shatru becomes jigrat and pa plus shatru becomes pibat. A few examples where a terminal t is replaced by t are da plus shatru becomes dadat, bhi plus shatru becomes bibhyat, and hu plus shatru becomes juvat. The other examples can be worked out in the same way. Now that we know how to create a Shatru Pratyayanta form, the next step is to learn how to actually use this form. The Shatru Pratyaya is always used to indicate the karta, the doer of the action to which it is attached. For instance, in the sentence Devadattaha Grantham Pathati, Devadattaha is the karta, and thus when the Shatru Pratyaya is attached to the Patha Dhatu, the resultant Pratipadikam Pathat will also represent Devadatta. In other words, Devadatta and Pathat, both these words indicate one and the same person, and therefore there will either be a Visheshana Vishesha Bhava or an Uddesha Videya Bhava between the two words. And therefore, one can use this word in a sentence along with the word Devadatta, like Pathan Devadattaha Gacchati, meaning Devadatta who reads goes, or Devadatta goes while he reads. This kind of usage of the Shatru Pratyaya in form of a Visheshana also indicates that the Shatru Pratyayanta words must exhibit the forms in all the three lingas, all the three vachanas, and all the seven vibhaktis. For instance, Pathan Devadattaha, Pathanti Sita, and Pathat Mitram. Let's inspect these in more details. The 21 forms of the Pullinga would be Pathan Pathantau Pathantaha, Pathantam Pathantau Pathataha, Pathata Pathadbhyam Pathadbhihi, Pathate Pathadbhyam Pathadbhyaha, Pathataha Pathadbhyam Pathadbhyaha, Pathataha Pathatoho Pathatam, Pathati Pathatoho Pathatsu, and the Sambodhana is identical to Prathama. It is worth noting that a na is heard in the first five forms of the Pullinga: Pathan, Pathantau, Pathantaha, Pathantam, and Pathantau. It is not heard from the Dvitiya Bahuvachanam onwards. This na gets heard in the first five forms of all the dhatus unless the dhatu is abhyasta. What is an abhyasta dhatu? Well, here is the table. All the verbs of the third gana are called abhyasta. So their first five forms will be something like dadat, dadatau, dadataha, dadatam, dadatau, where the na will not be heard. A few more dhatus of the second gana are also classified as abhyasta, namely Jaksha, Jagru, Daridra, Chakas, and Shas. The first five Pullinga forms for the Shatranta Pratipadikam of all these dhatus will not contain a Nakara. Moving on to the Napumsakalinga forms. In this case, the forms from the Tritiya to Saptami Vibhakti are all identical to that of the Pullinga. Only the Prathama and Dvitiya forms are special. Pathat, Pathanti, Pathanti, Pathat, Pathanti, Pathanti. Even here, it is clear that a na is heard in the Dvivachana forms for some Shatranta Pratipadikas, and similarly, a na is heard in the Bahuvachana forms for some Shatranta Pratipadikas. The rules here are unfortunately quite complex and various combinations are possible, but let's take a quick look. For the dhatus of first, fourth, and tenth gana, the na is heard in the dvivachana as well as the bahuvachana forms. For instance, pathanti and pathanti. For the verbs of fifth, seventh, eighth, and ninth gana, the na is not heard in the dvivachana, but it is heard in the bahuvachana. For example, kurvati and kurvanti. These two rows together cover all the ganas except for the second, third, and the sixth gana. Out of these, for the sixth gana, the dvivachana form gets an optional na and the bahuvachana form gets a compulsory na. For instance, likhat, likhati or likhanti, and likhanti. The next category is that of the abhyasta words, which includes all the verbs of the third gana and a select set of verbs of the second gana. In this case, na is not heard in the dvivachana form and it is only optionally heard in the bahuvachana form. For instance, dadati and dadati or dadanti. This leaves us only with the non-abhyasta dhatus of the second gana. Out of these, for the akaranta dhatus like ya, sna, etc., the dvivachana form gets an optional na and the bahuvachana form gets a compulsory na. For instance, yati or yanti and yanti. For the remaining verbs of the second gana, that is, those which are neither abhyasta nor akaranta, the na is not heard in the dvivachana forms, but it is compulsorily heard in the bahuvachana forms. For instance, bruvati and bruvanti. Finally, the case for all the atideshika dhatus. In their case, the na is heard in the dvivachana as well as the bahuvachana forms like pathayanti and pathayanti. And that completes all the cases. Complex table indeed. Interestingly, this is one of the few cases where learning the actual Ashtadhyayi Sutras is much simpler than memorizing the table because this entire table gets captured only by four distinct sutras of Ashtadhyayi. Nevertheless, moving ahead to the Strilinga forms. The Strilinga Pratipadika of the Shatru Pratyayanta word can be obtained by using the E Pratyaya on the Pullinga Pratipadika. For instance, Patha plus Shatru gives Pathat, that's the Pullinga Pratipadika. So we add an E to it, giving Pathanti, which is the Strilinga Pratipadika. This is a typical Dirgha Ikaranta Strilinga word, and all its vibhakti forms are similar to those that of the word Nadi. Again, it is impossible to miss the Nakara here. This time, the Na is present in the Pratipadikam itself, which means that it will be heard in all the vibhakti forms, starting from Pathanti all the way up to Pathantishu, and also in the Sambodhana forms. However, this na is not seen in all the Pratipadiks. For instance, the Shatru Pratyayanta form of the kru verb is kurvat, and when e is added to this word, the result is kurvati and not kurvanti. So there we have the inevitable, yet another table, this time giving the cases where the na is heard and not heard in the pratipadika of the Strilinga forms. Let's go over this table quickly. For the verbs of first, fourth, and tenth gana, the na is always heard in the pratipadika. For example, pachanti, nrityanti, and chorayanti. For the third, fifth, seventh, eighth, ninth gana, the na is not heard in the pratipadika For instance, dadati, chinvati, rundhati, kurvati, and janati. In case of the sixth gana, the na is heard optionally, giving two different pratipadiks, likhati and likhanti, thereby actually generating two different tables. One with likhati as the starting point, giving likhati, likhatyau, likhatyah, and so on, where the nakara will not be heard anywhere, and the other table with likhanti as the starting point, giving likhanti, likhantyau, likhantyaha, where the nakara will be heard in all the forms. The same is the case for the akaranta verbs of the second gana, giving two pratipadikas. For instance, yati and yanti. For the other verbs of the second gana, the na is not heard in the pratipadika stage. For example, bruvati. Finally, for the atideshika verbs, the na is always heard like pathayanti. One thing to remember here is that unlike the pullinga or the napumsakalinga forms, in case of strilinga, the presence or absence of na is decided in the pratipadika stage itself, and it is not dependent on any specific vibhakti or vachana. In other words, if the pratipadika has a nakara before the takara, then it will be heard in all the vibhakti forms, and otherwise it will not be heard in any form. Now that we know all the forms of the Shatru Pratyanta words in all the lingas, let us understand how to harness the real power of the Shatru Pratyaya. The real power of the Shatru Pratyaya lies in combining the two sentences where the karta of one sentence is reused in any vibhakti in the second sentence. Here is an example. Assuming that we are talking about the same Rama in both the sentences, it is worth noting that the word Rama, which is the karta of the verb pathati, is being reused in the Dvitiya Vibhakti in the second sentence. In such a case, the Shatru Pratyaya can be used to combine the two sentences in a single sentence by a simple two-step process. First, look at the sentence where Rama is used as the karta and apply the Shatru Pratyaya on that verb. In this example, that would create the form pathat. In the second step, we use this word as a visheshana for the word Rama in the second sentence by applying appropriate linga, vibhakti, and vachana. Since the word Rama is used in the Pullinga Dvitiya Ekavachana in the second sentence, therefore the word Pathat will also be used in Pullinga Dvitiya Ekavachanam, thereby giving Pathantam Ramam Mata Pashyati as a combined sentence. Observe that we have captured the meaning of both the sentences together in this new sentence. A few more examples where the Shatru Pratyaya can be used to combine two sentences are all here. In all these sentences, Devadatta is used as a karta for Pachati in the first sentence, and the same word gets various vibhaktis in the second sentence. The two sentences can be seen combined together by applying the corresponding vibhakti and vachana on the resultant Shatru Pratyayanta word, namely Pachat. There is another way to use the Shatru Pratyaya. If we have two completely independent sentences combined together using yada and tada, then we can use the Shatru Pratyaya to form a single sentence by getting rid of yada and tada in the process and using the concept of sati saptami instead. For example, consider the sentence Yada Devadattaha Shlokam Vadati Tada Krishnaha Agachati. This sentence can be rewritten by removing the words Yada and Tada and instead by applying the Shatru Pratyaya on the dhatu Vada by saying Devadatte Shlokam Vadati Sati Krishnaha Agachati. Observe what has been done. The word Devadatta, which was associated with the Yada clause, has been used in the Saptami Vibhakti, and the Shatru Pratyayanta form of the verb Vada, namely Vadat, has also been transformed into Saptami to match the Karta Devadatta. The verbatim word Sati is actually optional, so we can always say Devadatte Shlokam Vadati Krishnaha Agachati. It is important to note that in this transformation, the karta of the first sentence always goes in the Saptami Vibhakti because it is the Sati Saptami that is being employed over here. As another example, the sentence Yada Sita Grantham Pathati Tada Acharyaha Shrunoti can be rewritten as Sitayam Grantham Pathantyam Satyam Acharyaha Shrunoti. Here, the word Sitayam is in the feminine form, and hence the Shatru Pratyayanta Pratipadikam Pathat has also been converted into the feminine form Pathanti, and then its Saptami Ekvachanam Pathantyam has been used to match the word Sitayam. Well, that's all for the Shatru Pratyaya for now. Let us conclude with a beautiful shloka composed by Jayadeva in his Gita Govindam. Vedan uddharate jagan nivahate bhugolam udbibhrate daityam darayate balim chalayate kshatrakshayam kurvate paulastyam jayate halam kalayate karunamatanvate म्लेच्छान् मूर्छयते दशाकृतिकृते कृष्णाय तुभ्यं नमः. This single shloka mentions the 10 incarnations of Lord Vishnu using 10 different Shatru Pratyayanta words, all in the Chaturthi Ekavachanam. And before we conclude, here is a pop quiz for all the viewers. Is it possible to combine the following two sentences using a Shatru Pratyaya? If yes, how? And if not, why not? Devadattena yachyate tasmai devadattaya phalam diyate. In order to answer this and a few other similar questions that will test your understanding of the Shatru Pratyaya, please make sure to attempt a small quiz whose link is available in the description below. That's all for today, and we will be soon back with yet another such video on Sanskrit grammar. Till then, Shubham Bhuya.